The spirit world is an occupied zone. During the occupation of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union, there was a movement that was known as Samizdat. What they meant was, it turned into Charter 77. Basically, the law under the Russian occupation was that you were entitled to question, you were entitled to know what you were thinking, you were entitled to write everything down that you believed. That was all fine. You could have a manuscript, you could buy pens, you could buy paper, you could sit at your desk and you could work it all out. What you could not do was show someone else, because that act is an act of publication. It's a political act, and you could be arrested for exchanging views of any sort. Seattle is exactly the same way. They're vicious, violent, criminal people. You're entitled to think for yourself as long as you think for yourself. Don't try to talk about what you think with someone else. You will be grabbed and pushed into political frameworks by UW dialectical and blood-curdling mobsy. It's a media bully pulpit that they call SmackDown. Not surprisingly, they play hoops with foreign powers. Very praiseworthy professor of higher learning who I deeply admire said that to be human is to be a philosopher, that it was in human nature to question, that to be a philosopher one ceases to be human when the answer comes too quickly. One ceases to be a philosopher when the answer comes too quickly. You're approaching what you don't know with care by being careful with your question. Now, Seattle had an incident. It was called the Blue House Massacre. And there were coincidental things that happened to me that night that I've probably strung along somewhere in my writings that I do not intend to go into. Essentially, one of the sort of zealots who wants to impose on everybody's inner light an imaginary audience that isn't particularly friendly. He shot up the Blue House, painted the sidewalk with now, 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 killed himself. I like Lao Tzu. He was disappointed in the end. They say he walked into the desert, sick at heart with the ways of men. I don't like Marinetti, the Italian hothead, who gloated with Benito Mussolini's son over the fireballs that proved so cinema worthy of war. I prefer people who go about their daily lives faithful to kindred spirits who may be among them. The extremes of survivalism I do not like. They're not for me. I find survivalism to be a form of martial law. And our law enforcement and our universities are getting away with it, which is very, very tragic. It's not just the children in Gaza who are mortified. Our own children have seen what a sacrilege we're tolerating all the time by this imaginary audience we're forced to address when we sit at our desks with our pens and papers, not daring to cross the Siamese line because the spirit world is an occupied zone. But I'm not looking so much for an answer as posing the question as well as I can. The Rave Massacre was a statement, and I can't shake the Rave Massacre statement of the Blue House. So when I see the stakeout in Tacoma with the supernova and the cosmonaut business, and here are the age-old fundamentalist tripartite who's done such a number on Afghan girls in schools, started with a strange relocation of the rave and the border of Gaza, a call from Egypt, no fan of Arab Spring. I think of the Blue House. We've all seen the cars that were destroyed by Israeli helicopters. I don't think it was the Hannibal Directive. I think it was just mania. It was just the will to destroy. And for some reason, they've gotten their cover by evoking ancient mythologies from the time of the Old Testament. As a curse and voodoo against human rights. There's always been some hesitancy to go with left-wing politics for good reason. For one, they can't make up their minds amongst themselves about very much. For another, Arab Spring didn't really mingle with the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the Vietnam War era craze. And in fact, the civil rights movement was somewhat changed when the gentlemen of the leadership, Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, were lost. The movement served to a dead end in the 80s with the obliteration of the libertinage movement by the Sturm und Drang of the AIDS attack. And of course, we saw the notorious Pussy Ball movie that ended with the fall of the fourth dimensional and the rise of the third bronze winner from Japan at the Beijing Olympics, symbolizing the victory of Yoko Ono. Because Putin didn't like Hiroshima either. So they set up, the Tacoma Dome and the volcano and the blast in the Beirut gig, and the UW dialectical decoy with the COVID stuff, saying "kiss my ass" see the name Emil Kisser. It's Fripp, Ringo Starr, putting semen in the cup over here at the Red Elm, poison me on the lip. So those are the facts. That's the way I see it. I get a generation of people who glorify a suicide martyr like Aaron Bushnell. Sean Straub and Michael Foucault both gave themselves HIV when John Lennon pulled his Houdini. He wasn't about to do that. But they, see it that way. The people who did this hope that the survivors of Palestine would join forces with Diamond Nurgallis in Plague Mass. What was she doing studying demonism and immunology in the 70s, back when the letters were written? See, they're hiding in broad daylight that these were the Kennedy assassins. So what they're trying to do is, there is such a thing as religious fascism. There is. Israel Zionism makes that obvious. But it's rather broad brush that they're tarring with, because until they stomped Iraq and stomped Afghanistan, now they want to stomp Lebanon. Those places had humanities. Arab Spring was not 100% thoroughly and totally divorced from the civil rights movement. Both JFK and Martin Luther King credited Ho Chi Minh's attempts to reach out for independence. So I don't have an answer, but I have a question.